It's a long, long time ago. Nobody knows how long, but I guess at least 6,000 years in the past, and back then, gigantic spaceships revolved around the old Earth. How, for heaven's sake, would one know that? One knows it from ancient India. The Indians wrote diligently, and in many ancient Indian texts one can read in detail that thousands of years ago gigantic spaceships revolved around the Earth. The ancient Indians don't call these objects spaceships, they call them cities on the firmament. They didn't have any word for spaceships. These structures suddenly appeared, and one day smaller vehicles flew down from these cities to the earth. The ancient Indians called these vehicles vimanas, and they described them so precisely that it was possible for us to analyze the ancient Indian text sentence for sentence. And this here is the result. Now, today we have different types of airplanes. Everyone knows helicopters, jumbo jets, single-engined small planes, vertical take-off aircrafts. Just the same in ancient India. 18 different kinds of vimanas are described there. People were frightened when gigantic shadows glided out of the blue over the valleys. It is said that the animals were afraid. The birds stopped to chirp. It is also handed down that occasionally these objects even landed and took some people to these cities in the firmament. Finally, even 3 of these cities appeared on the firmament, and the war of the gods began. The cities were destroyed, and from earth it looked as if thousands and thousands of shooting stars were falling down. So far, the ancient Indian texts. If it was like that, if people were taken up to these cities, if they were instructed, this would have been expressed on earth. After all, there is an evolution in our world, a history of development, not only a biological evolution, but also a technological evolution. In this case, we speak of technical progress. Everything that we have today had to be invented, had to be discovered, had to be tested. But if people thousands of years ago were instructed on some spaceships up there, they would have brought knowledge down to earth. Things that don't fit into evolution of technology should have appeared. How about it? Are there such things? Well, the planet is full of them. I show you a few examples. By the way, dear reader, the original of this speech was German, and I repeat it now in English, of course, not word by word. In 1899, by the way, Greek divers discovered a wreck at the offshore of the small island of Antikythera, lying in 28 meters of depth at low tide. All sorts of junk came to the surface. One day, a strange object which landed in the cellar of the National Museum of Athens. What was this thing actually? An old inscription still sticks on it, found 1899 at the offshore of the island of Antikythera. Now, with modern methods, with acids, the object was cleaned. Some kind of characters appeared. Then a metal ring and 2 metal pieces placed crosswise. And finally, something like gear wheels, more and more gear wheels. The smallest as small as the diameter of a pinky finger. Some kind of scale appeared. You can see in the picture that the scale still goes into this rusty material. A big gear on the rear and again many smaller gear wheels, and the amazement was not bad as one discovered a real differential mechanism. Differential mechanism, dear guests, is modern technology. We need it in our cars. What kind of strange equipment was this? They soon found out that the equipment was some kind of planetarium in pocket size. It showed the planets of our solar system, but in relation to each other. If Jupiter is up there, where is Mars in the relationship to Earth? The orbital data of Pluto are also component of this strange machine. Pluto, as you know, is a small, teeny planet. We just discovered it in 1930. Nobody could have known something thousands of years before. The machine is of course terrestrial technology. There is nothing extraterrestrial. The question is, where from did the makers, the creators of this equipment, have their knowledge? Who showed them something about the orbital data of our planets? And where from did they know something about the teeny Pluto? I have no answer, but the facts speak for themselves.
Vom winzigen Pluto. Übrigens, nachdem die Apparatur über 81 Jahre im Keller.
And here comes the next mystery. It dates back from the year 1901 and comes from Istanbul. There, the palace of Topkapi was renovated, and in an old wood chest, the restorers discovered a map.
Dort hat man den Topkapi-Palast renoviert. In einer alten Holztruhe entdeckten die Restaurateuren eine Landkarte. Die Landkarte war auf Gazellenhaut.
The map was scribbled in 4 different colors on gazelle skin, and they knew very soon who drew the map. It was the Turkish Admiral Piri Reis. He drew the map in 1513. Thank God, Piri Reis had not only drawn, he wrote as well. In an accompanying text he notes, he composed this map from a package of much older maps that one gave him in Alexandria. At the top on the right side, you may see the southern part of France, followed by Spain, finally the point where Gibraltar would be today. You recognize the upper part of Africa. But what actually lies at the lower end of the map? The map of Piri Reis landed on the tables of several cartographers at universities. These men made a reading grid and transferred the old map to a globe. And see there, the lower part is definitely the Antarctica, with exact coastal outlines, with all bays, with offshore islands. Each position is there. But the Antarctica, that for us lies under eternal ice and snow for as long as everyone can remember. Nobody could have known something about it. Even the Turkish Admiral Piri Reis, who drew this map in 1513, could not know the Antarctica at all. At that time, it was still not even discovered. Someone must have mapped an ice-free Antarctica some thousands of years ago.
Eisfreie Antarktis kartografiert haben.
Have you ever been in Peru? I took this picture that you see here at an altitude of 3,500 meters above the Peruvian city Cusco. That is a classic Inca wall. They all look alike. Then you should climb up higher over the mountain of Cusco. Watch out. Thin air. You feel every heartbeat. And the higher you come, you experience an unbelievable landscape. What you see here has nothing more to do with Inca technology. That was pre-Inca culture. Rocks were cut in an incomprehensible way for us. In this picture, you see some smooth edges, and the nearest rock on the right lies so near that the stonemason would not even have had a chance to swing back the hammer. It seems that someone cut out rock parts just as people like us cut up a piece of cheese. At the top, you can again and again see glazing on the edges. By the way, there are no volcanoes in the proximity. Every time I climb up to it, I ask myself, what was happening here thousands of years ago? Now you recognize steps in the pictures, but on the ceiling, nobody can walk on these steps. Finally, we cannot work upside down. That means the whole block and all things were put upside down by some explosion. Well, all this was already here as the Spanish conquistadors arrived. The Spaniards asked the resident Inca what this was, and they answered quite naively, "This comes from the time of the gods." Which gods, please? There are no gods. Or do they mean extraterrestrials?
Welcher Götter? Bitte. Geradezu dramatisch wird es dann in 4100 Metern Höhe.
Absolutely dramatic. It becomes at the altitude of 4,100 meters. Here, we are on the Bolivian side of the Lake Titicaca. The place is called Puma Punku. You don't see a single tree. Nothing more grows in 4,000 meters of altitude. If we speak of 4,100 meters in our degree of latitude, then we land in eternal ice and snow. Not here, because we are closer to the equator. Huge platforms of andesite, granite, and diorite lie there all over. Diorite, dear viewer, is a plutonic rock. Diorite is harder than granite. The harder thing which we have is diamond. On the scale, diamond has the value number 10. Diorite, for comparison, has the value number 8 on the hardness scale. In order to work diorite, you definitely need hard metal. Forget all jungle wods, bones, and what else appears in the literature. It does not work with diorite. The experts believe that all these are the remains of a temple of the highland Indians, the so-called Aymara. Their descendants still live today. However, as this here was built, the Aymara were in the Stone Age. They could not have worked diorite. The largest platform up here was 89 meters by one single piece. Today it broke into 3 pieces. The calculated weight is nearly 900 tons. Highland Indians, thin air, no wood, no wooden rollers, would not be capable to move a 900-ton platform 1 meter. Originally, the huge boulders were tracked together with clamps. Copper would not work here because of the temperature differences. Copper is too soft, iron and wood too. For my part, I was in the highland of Bolivia 30 years ago. I was there when the excavations began, and in the ground always discovered some kind of strange pipe pieces. At the first sight, it looks like a water pipe. Assuming what you have here in the picture would be water pipe, you need the lower part of the duct in order to transport water. Now you could say, well, over thousands of years the 2 pieces slipped. Maybe the piece on the left was once on the bottom. But it was not so. We found only top parts, as if they came from a modern factory. What happened here thousands of years ago? Usually, if archaeologists find blocks which they don't understand, they invent a name. We speak, for example, of a sacrificial table. But up here, we find things that don't fit into any drawer, into any logistic. Here we have a block of diorite, exactly like this boulder here. Blue-green plutonic rock, and at the front edge you will see some accurate grooves. Maybe, dear viewer, you should also pay attention to the cut of the edges. And every few centimeters, a hole was drilled into the groove. Each expert today tells me, Mr. von Däniken, this can only be done with diamond drills. This kind of technology is otherwise not to be produced. But I speak about Stone Age. There is something wrong up here. If a stonemason cuts out something from a kind of boulder, scratch it in some groove, then of course, because of a counterpart must fit smoothly on it. That means there must be planning behind it. That's not a small boulder here. After all, it is 2.78 meters long. Now please, watch the different edges, the different levels, the precision, the thin rectangle with the gap at the upper corner of the picture. There must be planning behind, and planning means writing. The Highland Indians, the Aymara, had no writing. Please ask yourself the additional question, why was it made? For what purpose does a Stone Age society need this kind of precision? We made the effort. I had the help of engineering draftsmen. They unpacked several special tools, their millimeter paper, and made exact measurements. At home, we wrote a computer program. We wanted to know what actually fits in one another hair. And very soon, one feels just like a donkey. Because it turns out that it is without exception a matter of precast segments, just like a Lego kit. That clashes horribly with Stone Age. I already said at the beginning that there is not only a biological evolution, there is a technological evolution too. Also, a car of today is something much more ingenious than a car of 30 years ago. Here, in the highlands of Bolivia, this evolution of technology was turned completely upside down. The oldest elements are the most precise ones. Afterward, only junk came up. What is this here supposed to be? The object comes from Copan. Copan lies in today's Honduras. Because they don't know what it is, they name it anthropomorph figure. I could imagine something like a saddle where one sits on it. And in the middle, what kind of ball is showing there? We don't have the answers. Including, we don't know something about these priests or god figures in Copan. A closer examination shows that all of them carry small boxes on their chest, and with 10 fingers they operate some sort of keyboard. I am not of the opinion that they had computers. I just wonder, what did our forefathers watched on some strange gods not comprehend and then tried to imaginate? And the planet is full of these examples. This figure comes down from heaven to earth. A closer look, you could even recognize something like a microphone before his lips. You see the hand spread downward, inclining to the earth. The teeth float skywards.
Die Füße schweben himmelwärts. Ursprünglich, als die Stele noch nicht kaputt war, standen unten noch 3 menschliche Gestalten, die staunend himmelwärts blickten.
And then, One of the truly incomparable mysteries, in which I personally always take pleasure, lies here in the ground under this pyramid. The pyramid stands in Palenque. Palenque is in Mexico. However, in 1949, that all was overgrown, one dense jungle. Then Professor Dr. Rutz began with the excavations. On the top of the pyramid, they discovered 618 Maya inscriptions. They could find out whoever reigned the city, from when until when, what were the names of the rulers. On the top of the pyramid, a rectangular block was discovered. The block led to a stairway inside the pyramid. But back in 1949, this stairway was stuffed full with stones to the top. It lasted 3 years until only the stairway was uncovered. They finally landed under the pedestal of the pyramid and stood in front of a triangular door, something which was never been seen before. The door was forced open brutally with crowbars. That's why one piece is missing. And the excavators looked completely stunned into a 7-meter high room. The 7 meters arise because you still can go down deeper and higher up than you see here in the picture. Of course, back then in 1952, there was no fence. This came later. The chief excavator, Professor Rutz, wrote in his report on the excavation, "We didn't believe our eyes anymore. We looked into an ice grotto. Ice hung down everywhere. The ground was full with snow. Now we are here in the lowlands of Mexico. There is no ice and no snow. The ice turned out to be dripstones, a whole curtain 7 meters long, and the snow was in the end lime powder. They chiseled the dripstones off, cleaned the ground, and stood on this mighty slab, 3.80 meters long, 2.20 meters wide, one single block, weighing about 9 tons. On the slab, a drawing for eternity is chiseled on it. Someone sits inclined forward, almost like a racing motorcyclist. All around him, you can recognize something like a frame, or if you like, a framework. You also see that the figure sits on a chair. Closer examination shows that some sort of mask is in front of his nose, and he uses his hand to manipulate some controls. And the lower hand, you see the 4 fingers of the back of the hand bent in. He turns on something. Then the chair, and outside the frame, some kind of flame. After the discovery, the Maya archaeologists were at first speechless. How does such a plate with such a precise relief get under a pyramid? The burial chamber down there must be older than the pyramid, because no one would have been able to transport the slab with 3.80 meters length and 2.20 meters of width down the narrow stairways later. Now in archaeology, they always look for reasonable solutions. After all, we must have both feet on the ground. And so they suggested it can only be one of the rulers of Palenque, to be precise, a family member of this ruler family with the name of Pakal. Nevertheless, questions remain unanswered. Why in this impossible position? Just as if someone would sit on a motorcycle, bent over to the front. Moreover, there were admittedly characters all around it, but those were contradictory. There were date glyphs. We know the Maya calendar, the Maya dates, the so-called dating glyphs. But these glyphs are contradictory. They don't speak for the ruler Pakal. Moreover, the Maya calendar repeats itself every 52 years, so you don't really know where to start. One of the experts said, you can recognize a stylized cup very clearly in the middle of the picture. Therefore, the creature is the corn god who was called Nox. Another scholar suggested, no, that's a Maya boy. He sits on a sacrificial altar. What you see in the picture at the very right has nothing to do with the exhaust, fire or flames. That is only the stylized beard of the hairs of the weather god. In the new textbook, I just read that in the middle of the picture you could recognize clearly the tooth of the earth monster. All together would reproduce the opened mouth of that monster. Some archaeologists see a Maya priest falling down into this earth monster. But, so the same experts, you also see the cross of life. So the meaning is in reality death and life, or death and rebirth. Dear viewers, we are a strange society. I call it the not alone society. Something is offered to us, and since we all are so reasonable, we not alone nicely very behaved. Look at the picture in the middle. Do you recognize the cross of life? But something like a cross of life does not exist. There is no cross of life. The word cross of life is nothing but the hollow phrase that someone placed into the world. And the poor students must learn this nonsense as well, otherwise they don't obtain their certificates and don't get any further. By the way, people blame me that it is anyway wrong to consider this glorious picture as transverse picture. You have to turn the picture up, and then it looks like this. Now, it is generally known, and I am proud to say publicly, I am a dreamer. I would like to give only into consideration that it is the dreamers that keeps the world goes round, and not the pedant. If the specialists want to see the stone only as a vertical picture, never as a transverse picture, well, then my imagination has another suggestion. Just follow me to another country. We fly together now to Asia. It makes no difference whether it's India, whether it's Burma or Java. In the entire Asian region, you find these sort of temples. People call it stupa. It reminds us of a bell grip, bell form and bell basis. In Buddhism, the stupa has different meanings. I want to spare you these. One of the meanings is, the stupa is the vehicle to the world of the gods, or the means of transport to the world of the gods. If a person wanted to feel like one of these gods from the tradition, so he first should wash himself according to Buddhist ritual. He must jump into the river, and then he should powder himself and climb into the stupa. That's why someone sits in here, in every stupa, in this case the young Buddha, because it's a Buddhist temple. And what does he actually do in there? He sits here with his bent elbows and performs ritual movements with the hands. He imaginates or he imitates the gods. And then back to Palenque in Mexico. If we see it from this point of view, we would have the tower of the stupa, the bell form of the stupa. He sits there in the middle and performs his ritual movements with his hands with bent elbows. So if the experts say, I may never look the picture as a transverse picture, but only as a vertical picture, that's okay with me. There is a reasonable answer for everything. Maybe we only misunderstood it, misinterpreted it, both here and there, and the explanation was in reality quite simple.
From Mexico,
a leap to the distant Egypt. Archaeologists discovered there in 1954, under the desert of Saqqara, a hole in the ground. Under the sand came a wall. Under the wall, the bedrock appeared, and at the very bottom was a door. The stone door was sealed. It carried an unbroken seal of the pharaoh Sekhem-het. Only for the understanding, most viewers know Cheops. Cheops was supposed to be the builder of the Great Pyramid. That was the 4th dynasty, around 2500 BC. Sekhem-het, of whom I speak here, would be the 3rd dynasty, therefore even older than Cheops. Now they found the door with an unbroken seal. They were very, very confident to discover the old mummy of the pharaoh Sekhem-het down there. Finally, they reached an underground room.
Tauchten nochmals 2 Steintüren auf.
It was crude, hewn out of the rock. And in the center of the room, you will just see it, a phenomenal sarcophagus. Sarcophaguses are normally made of granite. This one was made of one single block of alabaster. Alabaster looks like marble. It is a form of limestone. And the sarcophaguses have usually a lid. That one here had a sliding door, just like an animal cage. At the upper end of the sliding door was again a seal of the pharaoh Sekhem-het, unbroken, and even the fragments of an enormous big flower arrangement was discovered. Now the archaeologists were absolutely sure that the mummy of Sekhem-het must be in the sarcophagus. Just remember the sealed doors. The sliding door was closed, and again a seal on it. And somebody had put a flower bouquet on it, thousands of years ago. Therefore, a mummy must be in the sarcophagus. Since they were sure, they organized a public tomb opening in May 1954. Journalists were here. The chief archaeologist at that time was Professor Dr. Zachariah Goneim, a man who was absolutely brilliant and honest. The students, his colleagues, admired and loved him. He was always willing to have fun. Dr. Goneim kneeled down with a small chipping chisel in his hand. Then he pushed up the sliding door a little bit and put wood pieces below it so that the door doesn't slide down again. And then a flashlight was lighted. Professor Goneim became as white as a sheet. The sarcophagus was empty. How can it be? Sealed doors, sliding door was closed, a seal on it, flower bouquet on parting, and thousands of years later, people come and the sarcophagus is empty. Of course, Professor Goneim was horribly angry about these disgraces. As soon as the press were gone, he went down once again alone. And now he crawled into the sarcophagus with his whole body. As he came out, he was no longer responsive. Everyone that knew him said he had some kind of glassy eyes. He didn't respond to questions anymore. Soon, later on, the highly respected scholar hurled himself over a Nile bridge near Cairo. Suicide. This kept bothering his assistant. The drama recurred. Now he crawled in with his body. The assistant killed himself 2 days later by taking an overdose of sleeping pills. It is understandable that the antiquity administration in Cairo got scared. Therefore, they installed the metal fence and the metal door and put padlocks on it. I was absolutely lucky to be at the right time on the right place, namely as the padlocks had to be replaced because they weren't trusty. I slipped in, could take a few pictures. Of course, I didn't crawl into the sarcophagus, otherwise I would presumably not stand here and give this speech. Later on, people ask me, tell us, why didn't you go in? Or why didn't you at least push a camera in? In the 3 minutes of time I had, I didn't even get around to do it. If you go to Saqqara today and you inquire about the tomb of the pharaoh Sekhmet, that tomb is in the meantime covered with sand again. The secret still lies under the earth. But Egypt is a country of great mysteries anyhow. I just explain you a few more of these mysteries. Just before I played a game in South America, I told you there is something wrong with the technology of the past. The oldest technology was the most perfect, and afterward only junk came up. I can play the same game here in Egypt. We are now in Abydos. Abydos lies by the Nile, and the great temple of the god Osiris stands here. Temples, dear viewers, doesn't stand by chance somewhere. Temples always stand at historic points. Incidentally, we don't have it differently. A church stands at some place. But why? Because before Christianity, that place was a holy cult place, or because the tradition says that a saint was died or tortured here, for instance. Churches and temples always stand at historic places, just as here in Abydos. The legend says the temple of Abydos was built at this place because the head of the god Osiris lays buried here. Osiris was the oldest god of the Egyptians, and Osiris came from the stars. But his brother Set was jealous and murdered him. The legend says that Set cut apart the body of Osiris and buried the different parts at most different places in Egypt. The head is supposed to lie here. That's the reason why the temple of Abydos was built exactly here. If you have once the opportunity to come to Abydos, ask your guide whether somebody knows where the head of Osiris lies. He will lead you a few meters out on the desert, and then you climb down in a hole. You stand in front of huge megalithes. Up to 100 tons were used. You don't get any razor blade between. Look at the technology. The precision, the oldest technology regarding the transportation, the weight, the cut, the needless, is the most perfect one. You recognize it in the picture. In the time scale, the gigantic stones on the bottom are the oldest ones. Later on top of it, only junk came up. Something is wrong. And we are confronted with the same mystery in Abu Zir. There, stones lie around like junk, and in many stones, hole. What's that supposed to be? If you drill a hole in a wall, imagine something like a corkscrew, and you press and turn it in. The drilled stuff crumbles out. You have a little bit dirt on the ground. However, there is another drilling style. It is ultra-modern and has been patented just in the last century. That is the core drilling. In this case, you have a hollow steel tube, and now the steel tube is pressed into the drill material. Mostly, it is reinforced with diamond on the front tip. That is high-tech. The drilled stuff stays in the tube. At the end of the tube, something like a stone sausages came out of the tube. Here, core drilling were definitely used. How is this possible? Where did the technology come from? By the way, this is a question which was never answered. And I made these pictures already 20 years ago. Another huge monolith lies a few meters above these drilled holes. And if you are there once, knock with your hands on it or with your fists. At each point where you hit on, you get a different sound. Ding, dong, dong. Sounds beautiful, and nobody has an explanation for it. Under the desert of Saqqara lies another mystery. Long tunnels, on the right and left, niches. Inside the niches, huge sarcophaguses. From the Egyptian chroniclers, we know that the ancient Egyptians worshipped a secret bull with the name Apis. And this Apis, according to the chronicles, had a different fur, a different pattern. Apis was created by the gods. The chronicles even wrote that Apis was a monster. He often caused smaller temples to collapse. He trampled field, killed old man and infant, and the people were frightened. But nobody was allowed to harm the animal. And we also know that the ancient Egyptians mummified every life form, every single one. Not only human beings, they mummified scorpions, fishes, birds, monkeys, spiders, cats, crocodiles, dogs, all species that existed. Everything was mummified. And where are these animals? Some of them here, in the tunnels under Saqqara. There lie 200,000 mummified crocodiles, 5 million mummified birds, the real Noah's Ark under the earth. Some 150 years ago, the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette was in Saqqara, not down here. That was still not discovered at all. He was above on the desert sand. Later on he wrote, he was in such a bad mood, was a little bit hungry, and stumbled over a stone. As he pulled himself up to his feet, he could decipher the word Apis on one of the stones. Auguste Mariette knew the history of the sacred bull. He knew that this Apis bull once existed, but people had never found the mummy of it. And now Auguste Mariette stands before a stone with that inscription, Apis. Auguste Mariette was very happy. He thought, here somewhere in the proximity, I probably find bull mummies of the sacrificed Apis for the first time. By the way, Auguste Mariette didn't proceed so carefully his works as archaeologists of today do. Today, specialists proceed very delicately with spatula and brushes. Auguste Mariette sunk dynamite poles into the ground again and again. Then he blew them up and holes were blown out. And in such a bang, he slippered down in person into a hole. As he got torches handed, as the dust dispersed, he stood in front of one of the big sarcophagi. Well, Auguste Mariette was really overjoyed. He said to himself, I made it. That can only be a sarcophagus of a sacred Apis bull. The lower part weighs 90 to 100 tons, and the lid alone is again 30 tons heavy. I myself am 1.68 meters small. If I hold up my hand, I come exactly as far as to the lid of this huge sarcophagus. Now you still have to know something, dear listener. The material of these sarcophaguses consists of Aswan granite. Aswan is a city by the Nile about 1,000 kilometers away from here. In antiquity, there were still 3 cataracts on the Nile. That means the heavy weights had to get off of the ships, had to be transported a few kilometers on the land, had to be reloaded to the ships or rafts again, and the whole thing 3 times. Now, dear viewers, I'd like to ask you to make the following consideration. Here in Saqqara, work troops are at work, cut out underground tunnels, niches on the right and on the left side. 1,000 kilometers away from Saqqara, other work troops are playing their part. They cut the hardest granite that exists in ancient Egypt, the Aswan granite, out of the rock. The raw material had to be polished. Look at the picture. How the stones were even polished from the inside with these precise edges. Then they transport the heavyweights down to Saqqara and move them into the underground passageways. August Mariette knew all this too. August Mariette and his helpers took crowbars. The men climbed on stage. The first lids were lifted up, and August Mariette let a scream out. He wrote later on that first breath had almost burned his lung. Gasping for breath, the men went on to the surface, to the desert, recovered themselves 20 minutes. Then they went down again with wet clothes around their faces. What happened? All sarcophaguses were filled up to the lid with bitumen. Bitumen is natural asphalt. There were asphalt seas in ancient Egypt. There are still some today. Later, the archaeologists took out this stinky mass with spades, transported it in wheelbarrows, and brought it up to the desert. Inside the stinky asphalt, they found thousands of small, splintered bones of different animals. How can this be? The ancient Egyptians mummified every life form because they were convinced of the rebirth. They believed, namely, that in order to be reborn, the body must stay preserved. And here, they experience exactly the opposite. A colossal work, underground tunnels, 1,000 kilometers of transport, heavy weights, and all of this only for broken bones? This doesn't make any sense, does it? How could we solve this mystery? I have only a small speculation to present. It is not quite so wild. There are, after all, ancient texts about it. At the end of the Pharaoh's empire, a priest with the name Manetho wrote down again the whole Egyptian history from the beginning. And he, like the historian Herodotus from Greece, wrote that 11,341 years ago, his time, the gods were on earth. The gods had helped mankind. They had built schools and streets and had shown mankind how stonemason work is done. And suddenly, the gods had started to create mixed animals. What is a mixed animal, please? Each viewer knows at least one, the Sphinx. A lion body with a human head is a mixed creature. You find mixed creatures in all museums. Go to Asia, start in Turkey, the craziest combinations. And we were always of the opinion that these are artistic creations. For example, the pharaoh wanted to symbolize the strength of the lion with it. Now this priest, Manetho, comes with his writings and claims the gods had made mixed creatures. Manetho gives a whole list of what kind of mixed creatures had existed in antiquity. And all these monsters, people would say chimeras today, were sacred. The sacred Apis bull was among them. I could imagine the following. Since I know from ancient India, and not only from ancient India, once mother spaceships revolved around the Earth. Small shuttle spaceships came out from the mother spaceships. The old Indians called them Vimanas. The old Egyptians called them the barkies of the gods. From the shuttle spaceships, the so-called gods descended, astronauts from another solar system. We all know that there are no gods, but our ancestors just believed that they were gods. Someday, the so-called gods made namely a few genetic manipulations with existing lives here. There were bulls already, there were crocodiles already, and different forms of life existed on Earth. But for what reason should extraterrestrials create mixed animals? A space-traveling species, which is hundreds of thousands of years on the way, knows, of course, most different planets. There may be planets closer to the sun, so it's hotter. On other planets, it's cooler. or a planet is bigger and the forces of gravity are stronger. Now, the ETs produce mixed creature in order to test which species would possibly be more heat sensitive. How about a lion with a crocodile armor or a bull human mixture? The legend of Minotaur in Greece. Or they created such a monster as the sacred Apis. They forbid mankind to hunt, to kill the animal, because they want to observe it. Someday, however, the work of the so-called gods was done. They returned to their small shuttle ships, from there to the mother spaceships and away. And at that time, some of these monsters still lived. As long as they lived, no priest, no human being dared to come close to these animals. So the humans waited until the animals died of a natural death, and then they chopped up the bones, built underground huge tunnels, transported the heaviest sarcophaguses from 1,000 kilometers distance through the chopped up bones and mixed it with poisonous asphalt and closed it. And here we have the result. Since the Great Pyramid exists, people argue about it. Now, in practice, it is not so as if I would only have difficulties with archaeologists. Thank God I have a very good relationship network, and among the Egyptologists I know a whole of humorous and clever men of integrity. But we have here and there a little bit different opinions that won't do any harm. The dispute does good. And regards to the Great Pyramid, all experts say to me that I should finally stop asking stupid questions. They say they know who created the big construction, when and how that happened. The experts are convinced that the Great Pyramid of Gizeh was built by a pharaoh called Cheops. This was about 2500 BC. That is approximately 4,500 years in the past, seen from today. According to the experts, Cheops was a tyrant. Up to 100,000 people were slaved away from him. Whether voluntarily or not is another question. The archaeologists believe that Cheops had only 2 rooms in his pyramid. The upper room is called the king's chamber. The smaller lower room, the queen's chamber. However, there is indeed a 3rd room in the rock under the pyramid. They call it the unfinished burial chamber. Finally, the corridors, the passageways to the 3 rooms. That's all. The whole rest is solid rocks. What actually do the old Arabs say about it? And by old Arabs, I don't mean a grandfather of today. I mean the Arabic chronicles. They existed too. Often, if I talk about the Arabic chronicles with the Egyptologists, they tell me, "Oh, Mr. von Däniken, you cannot really take this seriously. Those are fairy tales." Or many experts don't even know the chronicles of the Arabic world at all. Have you ever read something about a historian with the name Abdul al-Mas'udi? Or about a guy with the name al-Makrizi? Both Arabian historians. What do they say about the Great Pyramid? A complete different story. The Arabs claim that the whole thing happened before the Great Flood. At that time, mankind was still so primitive that they had drunk from the same waters as the animals. But of a sudden, the clouds had opened. The barques, the ships of the gods, were coming out of the clouds. First of all, the ship of the god Osiris. First, these gods constructed schools in the land on the Nile. Then the gods forced our ancestors into the schools. Maybe we should introduce this again. After some times, the gods realized that man was very thirsty of knowledge. Apparently, thousands of years ago, we were not stupid at all. The most intelligent of our ancestors, so the old writings, was a young man named Saurid. The Arabic historians note then very precisely in a subordinate clause, Saurid is the same person that the Hebrew called Enoch. Does this tell you nothing? Only as a subordinate clause, the historic took place before the Great Flood. According to Arabic traditions, it is said that Saurid was the most intelligent of us. But Saurid is the same person that is called Enoch by the Hebrews. Who is Enoch before the Great Flood? Go into the Bible or into the Torah. Before the Great Flood, there were 10 patriarchs. One of the 10 was called Enoch. According to biblical tradition, Enoch is the first human being that left this planet in a fiery chariot. It gives me something to think. So in ancient Egypt, Saurid was the most intelligent human being at that time. The teachers had called him to them, they taught him their language. Soon the young Saurid is bilingual. He can speak his own language and the one of the ETs. He served as an interpreter. Then the so-called gods gave him a quick writing device. I have never comprehended what they mean. What was a quick writing device before the Great Flood? And finally, they learned him to write and they dictated him books. Shortly after, the tidings start. A dreadful flood would invade the earth and all people and all flesh had to die. The young Saurid heard this too, of course. Meanwhile, he was maybe 18. He knew the language of the strangers. So he went courageously to them and asked them, "Why did you teach me how to write? Why did you dictate me books now that the water comes and we all die? Even if a few humans are left, they must start all over again from the beginning." And so he asked them for permission to construct a monumental building. In this construction, he would like to put many small chambers, and into the chambers his books. Because the time was pressing, and the time was pressing because of the coming flood, the teachers helped our Saurid with planning of the pyramid, only with the planning. You see, even according to Arabic tradition, no stranger had moved around stones. No one of them had got their hands dirty. Mankind had done that. But they helped him with the planning. And if someone here think that all this is just an Egyptian fairy tale, have a quick look at the Bible. The God of the Old Testament also knew in advance about the flood. And he also gave Noah the measurements of the ark. The Great Pyramid was built by Saurid and his people. He made many chambers in the pyramid and put his books in it. In 4 chambers, there were even gifts from the teacher of heaven for the future generations. Finally, Saurid made the whole pyramid waterproof by sealing everything with stones from above to the bottom. Now we have reached the so-called upward-going corridor. It is 20 meters long and roughly 1 meter high. In practice, this means down with your head, down with the shoulders, down to your knees. I often stand at the end of this corridor and wait for my tourists. Everybody arrive dripping wet. So don't go to the hairdresser before you climb into the Great Pyramid, dear ladies. Do it later. Now, after 26 meters, everybody stays and says, "Oh, ah, ooh," because now you arrive here. And this is called the Great Gallery. It is nearly 47 meters long, about 9 meters high. And here begins the first justified questions to all my friends in Egyptology. Can somebody explain this to me? Why did the builders of the pyramid start with the low corridor, so low that they were not even able to transport in a sarcophagus, not even a sarcophagus lid? And after 26 meters, this amazing construction here. Each stone layer is placed 8 centimeters over the next. Here, stone blocks up to 70 tons were used, an unbelievable work. Exact planning had to be behind it. But remember, Cheops and his people, who are supposed to have done it, came straight away from the Stone Age. How actually was this miracle possible? I put together a computer animation in order to explain the miracle of the pyramid building. For example, there is this story with the ramp, but the ramp must be continuously adjusted to the new height every day in the whole length. The ramp can hence nowhere a sharp bend in it, 4 kilometers long. The same applies if they build a spiral ramp around the pyramid. The ramp would have more volume, more content than the pyramid itself. There were other suggestions. Something great was succeeded there. 10,000 of workers were conducted. They say this so easily, but all this means training. This needs experience, this needs ropes and a certain logistic. The most different solutions that were presented are all taken for granted. If you encase stones with wood, as you see here, they must invent this at first. Nothing was suddenly there. Somebody must think that up and try that out before the construction started. But Cheops and his people came right away from the Stone Age. Every solution is conceivable, but it puts too much knowledge to the beginning. Incidentally, our Egyptologists are absolutely convinced that the 3 pyramids on the plateau of Gizeh were built at different times by Cheops, Khephren, and Mykerinos. The ancient Arabic literature, however, says something else. All pyramids were built before the Great Flood by this Saurid and his fellows. There are these shafts in the pyramid, pointing in 2 directions. If you extend the shafts by certain basic information, beginning of spring and autumn, so you aim exactly at the constellation of Orion and Sirius. This is not coincidence. The oldest god of the Egyptians was Osiris, wasn't he? Osiris is the same as Orion, and Sirius is the same as Isis. Even the pyramids stand by no chance at their position. They represent the belt stars of the constellation of Orion. Orion and Osiris are the same, and Isis is equal to Sirius. Even the glyphics are the same. In our solar system, we have the inner and the outer planets. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are 3 chambers. The distances correspond exactly to the distances of the inner 3 planets of our solar system. The Great Pyramid, incidentally, doesn't stand by chance somewhere. It stands exactly there, where the distance of the center of the Earth is equal in length with the distance to the North Pole. All this and much more may be coincidence. If you accept only 2 or 3 coincidences, then it becomes dangerous. Where did the information come from? I am standing now in the Queen's Chamber, that is the smaller chamber in the Great Pyramid. There are 2 shafts, one into the southern wall and one into the northern wall. This here is the shaft into the southern wall. But now it is important to know, dear viewer, that this shaft is known only since 100 years. 100 years ago, the wall was namely shut. No shaft was there. 100 years ago, an Englishman came. That was Mr. Dixon. He taped the walls with a small hammer. At 2 places it sounded hollow, south and north. Only now they brought chisel and hammer, removed about 6 centimeters and discovered a shaft behind the wall. If you light a lamp into it, the shaft runs flat for 2 meters. Then you recognize in the searchlight that the shaft is pointing upwards. All experts were of the opinion that both shafts, north and south, are symbolic shafts. Of course, archaeologists wanted to find out whether these shafts came again to light somewhere at the outer wall of the pyramid. There was no exit. That is why the experts believe that the shafts were at best 8 or at most 10 meters long. Then they would end blindly. A young engineer from Germany, his name is Rudolf Gantenbrink, wanted to know this more exactly by using modern technology. How would it be by driving a toy car into the shaft? One steers toy cars by radios, forward, backward, stop, etc. And then suddenly Mr. Gantenbrink becomes doubtful. What happens if the toy car is 40 meters inside the shaft and the radio signal doesn't get there? The stupid thing remains stuck in there for sure. So what that? Just imagine 500 years in the future, our descendants find the toy car in the pyramid. I can well imagine what kind of conclusions they draw from it. If it doesn't work with toy car, then high-tech is urgently needed. So Mr. Gantenbrink constructed this robot. The substructure was a steel frame, then electric motors were installed, a special video camera, 2 halogen headlights, then rubber caterpillars, just like a tank. The upper part can be pressed up with the hydraulic equipment. This gives strength on the ceiling, because for this robot, if they cannot steer it by radio, they need certainly cables. Therefore, they need strength. That's what rubber caterpillars are for. And then, sometime over 12 years ago, a new adventure began at the Great Pyramid. While you see these pictures, dear viewers, you must be quite aware of the fact that this shaft was built at the same time with the pyramid. It doesn't go the other way around. You cannot first finish the pyramid and then, afterwards, a priest comes and says, "Hey, I still need a soul shaft here." Well, that's great. The shaft has a side length of 15 centimeters. At this side, you don't get in any Lilliput man with chisel and hammer anymore. Thus, the shaft had to be built during the construction of the pyramid. Everything that you see on screen was made during the construction of the pyramid. The walls changed constantly. Once it was limestone, then it was sandstone. Gate-like openings of granite appeared. Suddenly the walls and the ceiling were plastered with cobblestones. Why? We don't know it. Finally, in the course of the drive, an obstacle appeared in the shaft. A stone beam had been put there across the shaft. The robot had to be steered out for several times. They had to fill it off, make it smaller, a little bit lower. Meanwhile, 40-meter distance was covered in the shaft. And then it was 50 and 60 meters. And slowly, the robot climbed up inside the pyramid. After around 64 meters, the experts couldn't believe their eyes anymore. Suddenly, a door appeared. The door had some kind of, small bracelets. One of those had broken off. The broken piece lay on the ground below right. You see how the laser beam even goes through underneath the little door. But Cheops is supposed to be Stone Age, isn't he? How does this fit? Another story begins 12 years ago with a Japanese team, namely scientists of more different subject fields, a team from the Waseda University in Tokyo. They X-rayed the Great Pyramid with most modern instrument. In their report, you read all measuring data of a whole labyrinth of chambers and corridors in the Great Pyramid. Why does nothing go to public? The discovery of Rudolf Gantenbrink is meanwhile a good 12 years old. Since 12 years they could have pushed in an endoscope. The doctors in medicine do this every day. The public was fooled 12 years long. Rudolf Gantenbrink, who had delivered a honest work, they have got rid of him. How come? Did he do something wrong? He was accused that because of him the whole thing came public. I asked back, why should it not come to public? Not we, the other side, the Egyptologists in Cairo, create the speculations. They themselves don't even know what happens in Cairo. After Rudolf Gantenbrink left, the Antiquity Administration in Cairo made a new contract with the National Geographic Society, a society free of tax. It has a very good reputation. National Geographic built a new robot. Then, on September 17, 2002, they told the public, now for the first time, before the eyes of the world public, a hole would be drilled into this door. Still during the broadcast, the word life was always inserted. The journalist asked Professor Dr. Zayhavas, is that the first time that you pushed through a camera? He said yes. Unfortunately, this statement didn't correspond to the truth. The hole already had been drilled earlier. The camera already had been pushed through. The Egyptologists in Cairo knew in advance that the second small door came behind this first door, and after the second door, a third one, and behind the third door, a room. So you see that the pyramid builders didn't build a shaft and a door for nothing. Please imagine that the ancient Arabic writings would have right. And in the pyramid, there are rooms with written records of times before the flood. Now everybody grew up in any religion. The Christians have their Old Testament, the old history. Also in the Muslim religion, people know the stories of Moses, of Solomon. There it is called Sulaiman, Noah, etc. And the same is, of course, in the Jewish tradition. So the basis of the world religions are the same. And now, we would suddenly discover books, writings that tell us something completely different about the deluge as what is handed down in the religious literature. Imagine that would be an occasion for a lot of dispute and trouble. Therefore, Egyptologists leave it better alone, which I personally regret very much. Well, to my feeling, the whole thing is down through unscientific.
Stories von Moses, Salomon, Sulaiman heißt dort, Noah etc. Und selbstverständlich auch in der jüdischen Überlieferung.
But now I want to leave the Great Pyramid and go over to another continent. Let's fly to South America. And there, in Peru, is another one of the great mysteries of the world.
Also lässt man's lieber. Was ich persönlich sehr bedauere. Das Ganze ist nicht wissenschaftlich. Doch wechseln wir das Thema.
If you ever have the opportunity to fly to Peru, then you should not only fly upward to the high places where you saw the very bizarre stones, but also southward. A gigantic desert lies 500 kilometers to the south of the capital city Lima. It is called Nazca. If you stand on the ground there, you may recognize nothing. Sand, desert, dunes. In the background, mountains. But soon, as you fly in an airplane over the same desert, lines suddenly slip off the ground, just as you see here. All kind of figures appears. Fish, bird, monkeys, man, but everything so oversized, so big, that you recognize them only from the air. On the ground, you hardly see something. Of course, there are many theories about this puzzle in Nazca, Peru. The oldest theories come from Miss Maria Reiche, a lady who already came to Peru in 1941. She planned to crack this nut. She sacrificed her life here. Miss Reiche believed once that the whole thing was an astronomical calendar. The calendar theory is dead since years. Miss Reiche died a few years ago, highly respected in Peru. She earned it indeed, but at the end of her life, she was embittered and suggested maybe it has to do with some shaman or with ghosts. Then others came, for example, the American Jim Woodman. He believed that Nazca was nothing other than a balloon starting place for hot air balloons of the Inca rulers. Another one speaks of a cult of the water gods or a cult of the mountain gods. You can, if you want, literally swim in a whole orgy of cults. In reality, we have nothing proven. It reminds me of certain luxury restaurants. The bill is presented, but nothing on the plate. We filmed Nazca with helicopter. And here I put a short film together. The film shows mostly these strange lines on the desert of Nazca. By the way, I wrote in none of my books that these lines were the runways of the aliens. All true clever journalists always quote me like that. I called the whole a cult. And Nazca is a single gigantic enigma, despite all explanations. There is cult thinking for every possible variation. But the actual mystery was not solved until today. Just watch the pictures and make up your mind. This desert in Peru remains the unsolved mystery in South America. In Nazca, you literally learn once again to be astonished. There are things here that you see nowhere else in the world that simply don't fit in anywhere. You recognize on the pictures that we are in a mountain. Some of the lines cross each other. Then you see small lines. The longest of these small lines is in reality 23 kilometers long, crossing over hills and mountains and ending in one of these lines who looks like some sort of landing strips. By the way, the natives who live here, they call these large line las pistas and the small one las líneas. Now here in the mountain, a normal mountain tapers from two sides to the mountain top. That here was once such a normal mountain. But someone cut down the whole mountain. What happened here a long time ago? Under the runway-like lines, you recognize zigzag lines. So this was not about scratching off the surface structure with shoes or with stones. If that would be the case, the zigzag lines underneath would also vanish. As you see here, it is still there. In the background, you recognize broken off mountains. I was several times there and was always searching for the excavated material, actually the cut off material. Someone seems to have transported it away. And then there is still another sensation in the dry mountains, geometrical figures. Very strange. If you have good eyes, you recognize terrain cuts. The points and lines run even over the terrain cuts. Nobody knows what it was. But the question must certainly be, who put geometrical messages in the past in a way in the mountain that the recipient must have been able to fly? Otherwise, you don't see it.